This is Awareness Explorers.
Well, welcome back, fellow explorers, to Awareness Explorers. I am your host, or co-host, Jonathan Robinson, and I'm with my trusty friend, co-host, and a cosmic compadre, I guess. Your
Brian
name?
Tom.
Yeah, okay.
It's Brian Tom O'Connor, and I like compadre. I
Compadre.
had to look it up the
Yeah,
first time
yeah.
you said it, but it's a word.
Okay, good.
Yes.
And we have another cosmic compadre today that we'll be interviewing, somebody who I've been working with, and I find his ideas and techniques to be incredibly beneficial to me. His name's Rastal. Those of you in the Perfectly Okay community probably know him quite well, and we'll talk about what that community is. But Rastal is a researcher and entrepreneur in well-being and the consciousness space. He has a website at ConsciousCuriosity.cc. He has a fascinating story to tell and some amazing methods. Welcome to Awareness Explorers, Russell.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So you do have a pretty interesting story background, and if you could briefly tell people a little bit about you and how you came to be someone that is on Awareness Explorers, is famed in the Perfectly Okay community. I would love to hear a little bit of that story. I only know it very briefly myself.
Sure, I'll give a high-level overview. We can dive into anything that sounds interesting. So I was born and raised in a pretty conservative Christian household, and uh, basically was planning on becoming a minister with the Assemblies of God. And like I did training to be a minister, almost got my credentials with them. And then halfway through the ministerial internship, it's kind of the classic go to seminary, lose your faith kind of thing. Except I didn't lose my faith. I just lost my religion. Like I couldn't resonate with uh, the Christian, belief system anymore. But I knew that I had experienced a lot of really powerful, interesting things through Christianity that I didn't want to let go of. And I struggled for a while to find ways of reframing that for myself. Um, One of the things that I ran across as I'm like exploring all these different things like chaos magic and, the new atheism and all these sorts of stuff was Jeffrey A. Martin's research on what he called at the time persistent non-symbolic experience, where he's studying all these different traditions that have claims of awakening or enlightenment or non-dual experience, the peace that surpasses all understanding, all these types of experiences, and distills it into a pretty common kind of universal human experience. And that was incredibly fascinating to me. And just reading the research itself gave me glimpses of the experience he talked about. Like I could tell that I was like, oh, whoa, this is a new sense of peace that I've never really noticed before. Because until then, all my experiences with Christianity were these really heightened, very active, what Abraham Maslow might call peak experiences, where I could tell there's just a lot of energetic movement in my body, and like it was very exciting. But then the come down was always really rough, and because I have to go back to normal life after that. But there was something about the way Jeffrey Martin wrote about, and his studies on these what Maslow had called the plateau experiences, where it was really just a stable shift into your baseline, just a little bit more elevated. It's no fireworks. It's just is a lot nicer on a moment to moment basis. So I get a glimpse of that. I stayed up to date on Jeffrey Martin's research for about a decade. Every now and then I'd read up on what he had, because that was around 2011 that I first came across it. I was getting my first glimpses of what he now calls fundamental well-being, but never stabilized. It was just passing here and there. And every now and then, every few years, I would go back and read some more research. Every time, it would just give me more glimpses of the experience, and I thought it was really awesome.
What's interesting about that is it's really an underutilized tool. To read about people's descriptions of higher consciousness can trigger those experiences. And nobody it talks about that as a tool, but it's a really incredible tool. If you read about somebody who's in the total love state, you start to feel that. If you read about somebody who's in the total peace state, you feel that. And he has a lot of descriptions in his book, The Finders, and on his website. And I found that as well, that if you read a really good description, it's like a poetry experience where it just brings you into that experience. It's amazing.
Yeah, I will give the caveat though that his typical caveat, I don't feel as strongly about it as he does, but he apparently found that actually the more descriptors you give, the more it can hinder someone from getting that
Mm,
experience themselves because the mind starts to get in the way of it. And really, I consider a lot of this work to be somatic work. It has very little to do with mindset and beliefs. It affects your beliefs because if you change your physiology and your level of perception, you literally can't believe certain things anymore. Like if you don't
mhm,
perceive there to be a self, how can you have self thoughts? You know, it's just like not a thing that can exist once you shift your consciousness, whatever you want to call it, a certain way. But while the mind is still there, it'll try to be the thing and interact with the thing, and it's going to have the wrong idea about what the experience is because the experience is just underneath all of that,
yeah,
what the
and you're
mind
caught up
constructs.
in your mind again.
Exactly. So there, I have found it to be beneficial. I know a lot of people. I like anecdotally, I've heard of a lot of people who also find it to be beneficial,
Uh-huh.
but I usually give that caveat just in case.
Right.
If it feels like it's taking you away from it, then stop looking up descriptions. But yeah, it can be really powerful. So
Uh-huh.
There's
So you were
another
reading his stuff. Go on, but Brian.
there's another caveat that I've discovered about it, particularly with Jeffrey Martin's work, in that, the old 12-step saying, compare and despair. People think, oh,
Mm,
look at what they've achieved and look at what I haven't. And and so, but I think forewarned is forearmed, that as you say, it's not about the belief or the intellectual understanding. It's about the experience.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, the experience is absolutely the key to all of it. And as long as you can, you know, bypass any mind stuff that's getting in the way and like get directly to the experience, that's right. That's absolutely the most powerful part, the most powerful technique you can do. So yeah, so I was, coming back and forth into Jeffrey Martin's work, dipping into his research every now and then. I think he calls the different stages of progression locations now, but back when I first encountered, he was still calling it buckets because he did not want to consider it a continuum. He didn't want to believe that there was a progression at all that happened. But then the more people he talked to, the more it became really obvious that these stages typically unfold in a particular order. So he's like, all right, they're just locations, you go one, two, three, and so on. And so I was going back and forth, reading these and getting glimpses of different locations. And a little bit more context. So growing up all my life, I had struggled with suicidal depression, anxiety, all these different things, and had PTSD from my childhood, like really bad complex PTSD from some fairly dark childhood stuff that happened to me. And it, even though I was getting glimpses of fundamental being, it never felt like it was the right thing for me to focus on at the time. Like, okay, I don't need to pursue this 100%. This is waiting for me. I knew it was there because I had these real experiences that I could not, even if I wanted to like try to write them off, it was really hard to because they were really pretty profound experiences. So as I'm dipping back and forth into the research every few years, I'm also started, seeing a therapist. Especially I was doing EMDR to deal with my PTSD, which did significant helped me significantly with my trauma. It was really incredible, especially considering when I first heard of EMDR, you're just moving your eyes and you're supposed to heal your trauma. I just thought it was quackery. I was like, there's no way this is true. Like this is 0%. But then the more I read on the results that people were getting, I was like, this this is kind of wild. Oh, and then okay, not only was it yeah, you just move your eyes and suddenly you're healed from trauma, but also it works on pre-verbal infants was another thing, another claim I heard. And I was like, this is impossible for this to be a real thing. But no, it really is. And it like there's tons of evidence and third-party studies on the efficacy of it. It's wild. I can tell from my personal experience how effective it was. Just some incredible progress I was able to make on things I could never face on my own or through traditional therapy, like talk therapy. It was really, really incredible. So at a certain point, I'm handling all these things. I'm not suicidally depressed anymore. I have bits of depression, but it's not suicidal. My anxiety is really low. I'm getting treated for my ADHD, things like this, things that have like really complicated a lot of my existence. And suddenly I remember, oh, there's this PNSE, persistent non-symbolic experience at the time, what he now calls fundamental well-being. Maybe I'll go look into that and see, maybe now's the time. Like now that I'm fairly happy. And I got into the research again, and all of a sudden, in the the year leading up to me making that decision, they had come out with all sorts of resources on, hey, here's basically our protocol without giving you the specific methods we use. Here's how you want to approach getting into fundamental well-being if you want to do this on your own. So they had all these extra resources that were not there when I first became aware of his research, because they had been running what he originally called the Finder's Course, to help people transition into this stable experience of lasting inner peace. And then he turned it into 45 Days to Awakening, which is run by the Fundamental Wellbeing Foundation now. Also, it's a more abbreviated course, but to help people who were not in fundamental well-being at all, had no access to stable underlying inner peace, except in glimpses, and were able to get them stably and persistently into that experience. And really, really effective. Like the effectiveness rates is pretty incredible. How much they're able to get people into that experience. So based on those learnings, they're putting out all these resources and telling people like, hey, here's some myths about how you need to get into this experience of awakening or fundamental being. And so I took all that.
Did
Yeah,
you
go
end
for
up
it.
taking the Finder's Course or the 45-day challenge?
No, neither.
Neither.
Yeah, I
Well,
cobbled together
now
my
I
own.
really hate you because I took all of them and I'm not persistently in that state. But so how did it proceed?
Yeah, I actually got I was on the email list and I got notified when they first offered the Finder's Course, and I like I was not in a financial position to just be throwing out 2 grand, which is what it
Yeah,
costs at the time. But I still really considered it because it just sounded so incredible. Like, oh, I could not have this underlying anxiety under everything. Like, was that
yeah.
even a real thing? That's pretty incredible sounding. I didn't do that, obviously, but I basically used all the resources they've been putting out and cobbled together my own transition protocol.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, okay, I'll give this an hour a day for 6 months. I'll like commit to up to 6 months because I figured if this experience is as good as it seemed like in glimpses and is anywhere remotely as good as he pitches it, because Jeffrey Martin's are really, really good at selling this. Like he is very incredible at making it sound amazing. So there's an element of me, the skeptic, that was like,
Yeah.
okay, take this with a grain of salt. Even if it's only a fraction, though, of what the claims he's making, it still sounds like it'd be a pretty worthwhile investment to spend a lot of time doing it. So, I cobbled together a couple of resources. He gave this talk at, I want to say, MIT, Finding Your Meditation Fit. And when I watched it, he was talking about, oh yeah, use these to get focus or relaxation. But I'm like, these sound like what they probably use in 45 days or the Finder's Course. Like this just
So you
sounds
stole the
really.
Finder's Course. You
So I stole the
actually,
Finder's Course,
yeah,
yeah, because they also came out with an ebook, How to Safely and Stably and Reliably Transition into Fundamental Well-Being, but they didn't put any of the methods in there.
yeah.
And so because they were like, it's too powerful or whatever. There was some concern about sharing this with people who were mentally unstable, because in the first Finder's Course, there was someone who had some who was suicidally depressed going into it and had a pretty bad time because this is affecting pretty low level nervous system stuff. Like it's very, very intense work that's happening on the nervous system, like direct consciousness work. So anyway, so I took that and I was like really disappointed that there were no methods in this ebook. I was like, man, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna figure it out. And then turns out he had this video where he's teaching all these MIT students how to meditate. I was like, this is the thing. So I went through that video, figured out something that felt like it was changing my system. Like it felt like when I was doing the meditation, literally like snakes were writhing in my brain. It's the weirdest thing to say out loud, but that's physiologically what it felt like. Some kind of weird energetic thing was
Uh-huh.
going on. And I was, ready to go an hour a day for 6 months. Every week, if it wasn't working, I would change to a new thing. Within 3 days, I had stably transitioned into fundamental
Wow.
well-being. Yeah, it was pretty incredible, like beyond what I expected for sure. And then yeah, the kind of just all downhill from there, basically.
But, for those who don't know, the 45-day challenge, I think he teaches like 6 or 7 of the methods that rose to the top. And I'm a method junkie. I figure when I took the Finder's Course, which is a little bit longer course, like 4
Mhm.
months, that I would know all the methods. I think he taught 12 methods or
Oh,
15
wow.
methods during that course. And I was surprised. I only knew like 2 out of 15. Because a lot of the methods have only been around for like 5 years. You know,
Right.
they're not the 2,000-year-old methods. They're like ones that have just been invented. And do you find that true, Brian? You're a method junkie. You took the 45-day challenge, right?
Yes, I did. Oddly enough, and I enjoyed it very much, and it was great to learn about all these methods. But oddly enough, my takeaway from it was that the method I had been using going into it was the best for me.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, it's good
But
to get confirmation, you know.
yeah, absolutely. But I really do like, and just circling back for our listeners who may not be familiar, I really do like the term fundamental well-being and also the term persistent non-symbolic experience. Because to me, fundamental well-being is our base state, not dependent on particular experience.
Right.
It's
Exactly.
and and non-symbolic experience is direct experience unfiltered by those incessant thoughts about the past and the future. Do you would those be good definitions in your view?
Yeah. For me,
Yeah.
yeah, that sounds good to me.
And
I
what
think
a,
that's really sums it up.
but what about locations? Could you just maybe give? I know that there are a lot of them, and it's a complex subject. But if someone's new to it, how would you describe them?
Yeah, so on a technical level, I think the way Jeffrey tends to think of them is like reconfigurations on the nervous system. Like to go from location one to location two is like a legitimate, the nervous system reconfigures itself. I tend to think of it as you go from perspective to perspective is kind of a good way of thinking about it. So location one to location two, you are going to literally perceive things differently. Like you're gonna have different, somewhat different body sensations showing up. The way visuals show up for you is going to be slightly different. The way thoughts arise and your relationship to thoughts and emotions is going to be slightly different. So it feels like a different perspective, and it comes with, kind of naturally comes with beliefs, but beliefs are almost an expression of that perspective, not you suddenly have a new ideas. Um, so to
One way I
very,
describe
very,
it, Rastal, for
yeah,
people
go
who
for
are
it.
really rather unfamiliar, is it's a little bit like, and this is a less accurate metaphor, but it's almost like the effects of different drugs. You know, like MDMA has a lot to do or kind of mimics location three to a large extent. You know, I find that ketamine mimics location four to a large extent. LSD can mimic location five or six to a large extent. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, if you have experience with those types of drugs, you know that they're really different experiences. They're not subtle differences. They're like whole different ways of relating to reality.
Mm-hmm.
And the locations, each of them kind of have that change in entire way of relating to your experience.
Yeah, I will give a note on that though, that the further out you get, so like especially once you get to location 7 through 9, um, that's where the changes actually become a lot more subtle from location to
Mhm.
location. We can still pretty much measure, it measures a really strong word for where we're at now in the science of this, but it's when you know what to look for, you can gauge whether someone's in location 7 versus 8, whereas the person who is shifting from 7 to 8 might not even think anything happened, but then you ask them, okay, well, what about this? How's this showing up for you now? Then they start giving different answers than they were before. They're like, oh, I
Mhm.
guess, wow, looking feels different is kind of, for that specific example, like literally the way visuals are showing up and the way it feels to look out at things feels different than it did before. So, okay, that's a different experience than you had. So it's not the same experience, just like you thought it was.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
but it becomes very, very subtle the further out you go. Yeah.
Hmm. And
Anyway.
just to let our listeners know, I've done 3 sessions with you of you guiding me, and you do this now for a living, where you guide others into progressive locations in a way. So we might start
Mhm.
out location two, and then through a technique, you might help somebody go into location three, four, five, six. Evidently, I've been through up to location 9.5. And
Yeah. Yeah, I can't remember exactly, but yeah, it was around there. Yeah, for
yeah,
sure. Oh,
And
yes, I remember now. Yeah,
yeah,
that was
and
fun.
it's fascinating to go, yeah, no, this is different, this is unique, and each one is almost like contrasted with the previous one. Like, oh, I guess I let go of that. Now I'm into this, and that the more I sink into my current experience, that's the doorway to the next experience, and that's
Right.
fascinating. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting yeah, I can go a little bit into how that was discovered, how what my experience was.
Mhm.
So the work I do that you're talking about is specifically people who are already in what we call fundamental well-being. They're at least in the early stages of this, awakening non-dual experience. I help them go deeper into it with the goal of eventually making fundamental being just always in the foreground. Because if you push far enough, it's just always there, no matter how unpleasant things are, no matter how rough life can get, no matter how much stress you're in, you're still at peace. And that's in the foreground, not you have to go looking for it. You can't get away from it. It's pretty incredible getting that far out, but it takes some work. So that's what I do to help people. In my own experience, I got into fundamental being, and then I was already consuming everything I could by Jeffrey Martin and anything they had put out on this. I didn't really look at other teachers, I was like really focused on anything empirical sounding, at least sounding. I don't know how empirical it actually was in retrospect, but it at least felt like it had somewhat of a basis in actual studied experiments, that sort of thing. And he had recently come out with his concept of the Martin matrix, which was his sort of map of this experience. So there's these locations that we're talking about, which are shifts into these like different progressive perspectives, and then layers. We don't have to get into this, but it's like kind of a set of experiences that are available at every location. And they have slightly different qualities to them that you can access and focus on. But the way he described going from location one to location two, it's like you could just literally sink lower and lower, and suddenly aspects of location two are showing up with location one, and then eventually it's just location two and none of location one. So it's like one could lead into the other. And I think he had a graphic on the talk for it and everything. And there's something about that just like stuck with me. So I was trying to practice. He also recommended what he calls sinking in as the number one practice for finders if you want to expand your experience of fundamental well-being and deepen it and stabilize it. And it's basically just notice that sense of peace that you now have and just focus on it very gently, not trying to make it be anything. Just like focus on it, like taking a warm bath, just like basking in it, like savoring it, really relishing it. You don't have to analyze it, just let yourself experience it. And then as you're doing that, then you can go into the deeper version of, let's say, location one, which is where I started out at. And then sure enough, as I did that and just let myself experience it and go lower through it, suddenly I was getting something new showing up. I didn't know if it was location two, right? Because I had no experience. I wasn't taught by him. I was cobbling together all these resources, very, very hacked together. Um, and but suddenly something new was showing up. I was like, oh, this is not have been part of my experience. So let's just see where that takes me. And the more I went with that, the more the previous experience started receding a bit, and this started taking over. I was like, hey, this actually kind of reminds me of some descriptions that people say of location two. Wow, that's really fascinating. I wonder how I can get this to be my stable experience. And so it felt like I would inch myself, like my center of gravity would try to inch its way into that until it just became where I was. And I would try to do the same thing with location three of like, oh, I'm thinking through location two, this spacious or whatever experience. There's a lot of different qualities to it. And all of a sudden, there's like a sense of, oh, like a rich fullness, or there's something there that's different. And okay, so I just let myself keep lowering, and all of a sudden that's taking up more and more of my awareness. It's like, oh wow, this seems like it's location three descriptions now. So it seemed exactly what he talked about, where it would shift from one to the other as I would just lower down, really seemed to be happening for me, which was really unexpected. But still, I didn't have anyone else validating it. So I was like, man, I'm just probably making all this up, which is now I know is a really common experience because it's all happening in our heads to some extent, if you want to say that. So like, who really knows if anything that any of us are talking about is related to what anyone else is talking about in their experience? I'm a little bit more confident about it now, but still, there's definitely times where I'm like, man, I don't know. That sounds way different than my experience. So I was having all this. I was thinking maybe I'm just making all this up. Who knows what I'm really experiencing? And then there was an experience I had of, um, yeah, I did a yoga session with my EMDR therapist, and at the very end, we did a yoga inversion where you like stand up with my shoulders were on this chair and my legs were just straight in the air. And for some
Uh-huh.
reason, that just something clicked in my nervous system and it shot me to location 4, which is uh typically the description of it is where there's no emotions and no agency, is how the typical description of it is. It's not as scary as it sounds. For anyone who's hearing that and loves their sense of making decisions, it doesn't feel anything like you think it feels like. Um, but I could tell that, oh, these decisions are now making themselves. Like I'm just observing these decisions happening now. When I used to feel like I had to exert effort to make these decisions. And then I
Right.
also was sensing like, oh, that, do I remember what emotions feel like? Which was probably a good indication that I didn't have the same emotional experience that I did just prior. And so that was the first thing, because until then, my goal was just to get to what he calls location 3, which was this, oh, you're at one with everything. It's all full of love. Even terrible feelings actually just feel like love in the experience and all these sorts of things. And I didn't realize I had already gotten there because I thought I may have just been making it all up when I was doing these shifts down, through the locations. And then suddenly I'm in this obvious new experience where I'm not having the experience of making decisions consciously. I'm just observing these decisions getting made. I was like, oh, I guess I was already in 3. I wasn't just making it up. But now that I know what this feels like, it's not at all what I expected. It's actually pretty incredible feeling. I wonder if I can use the same thing to get further. And then sure enough, yeah, the that shifting lower technique actually worked for, and I mean, I kind of blasted off from there. It was kind of
Uh,
incredible.
I should mention that your 5 or 6 minute description of that, I probably watched you on some of your other videos where you've probably spent 3 or 4 hours talking about it.
Yeah.
It's not that it's that different, but there are levels of subtlety to it. And that's
Yeah.
partly what you do with your work with people when you guide them individually. And I think you also just inspired a lot of people to stand on their head, including me. So
Yeah, it was a pretty
you
I,
haven't talked about that as your magical technique before, and I will give that one a try as well.
it's the one spot where until I was doing this work with people, it was like the one spot where I felt like I kind of cheated because I didn't actually have a technique that I used. It just happened at me.
Yeah, right,
Very
right.
unexpected. I was going into that just to clear out some, physiological blockages, and turns out it affected my progression with this whole experience.
Yeah.
So yeah, go stand on your head, folks.
There was a quote on your website which gave me hope, because sometimes I feel that the model in the Martin matrix is um, causing smoke to come out of my brain. Like sometimes it's so complicated. It's got to be simpler than this. But you have a quote that says all models are wrong, but some are useful,
Oh yeah.
and that gave me hope. But what would you say to a person who, because and oddly enough, this is contrary to my direct experience of the people who I've talked to. My suspicion was that all of these ideas about layers and locations would cause a certain type of person to completely get into their analytical brain.
Oh, 100%.
And so, and yet, talking to you, talking to a lot of people we've had on this show who are in that community, I don't get that sense at all. But do you have any advice for someone who might want to just completely turn this into an analytical exercise?
Don't do it. No,
No,
I
Bob
Talking,
mean,
Newhart, just stop it. You
right,
know?
yeah,
just stop it. Exactly. No,
as Bob Newhart might say.
yeah, exactly. It is, I mean, as we mentioned towards the beginning of this, I don't even remember if we were recording at that time, but it is about the underlying experience. The more you can get into the underlying experience and have that be your primary thing you're focused on, maybe the analytical stuff is supplemental to that. And there is a point that you can get using the model. I don't want to get into the technical details, but it's hard to not to avoid it. But let's say like location 4 or 5 or so. At that point, there's really a lot less self reflective thinking involved, and the analytical mind doesn't seem to get in the way as much. So once you get to that point, actually bringing the mind in to analyze can just help integrate the experience. Whereas in the early stages of it, I mean, block is a really strong word, but it kind of applies for a lot of people. So what I do in my work with people who don't yet have access to, they just have access to the 1 through 3, for example, the really early stages of this process. Most of what I do is just getting them to sit with their experience. It will sit for an hour, hour and a half. We'll take a full session, maybe 2 sessions of just, all right, the mind is there, let it do its thing, but let it be doing its thing from the place of this underlying sense of peace, and just see if that changes things. And like, okay, it for a lot of people, it tends to go even crazier. It's like, oh, you're letting me do my thing. Yeah, I get to like go wild now, and all these thoughts are happening. Now I'm going to overanalyze it. But at some point, if you're still maintaining this like focus, the core focus on that sense of peace or stillness underneath it, at some point the mind runs out of steam. There's only so much energy it can exert before it's like, oh, I guess you're not trying to get rid of me. I can actually just be part of this process. And doing that seems to help a lot of people make really easy progress from there. And I've had several people that I've worked with in the first talk with them, in the first session with them, I was like, all right, maybe this will be another person who just doesn't work with, which I've had one person so far out of 15 to 20 people that we tried this with. One person couldn't get any results with. Everyone else, I'm just like, okay, maybe this is the next person, is kind of what I go into just in case. I don't want to get my hopes up that it's going to be 100% effective. Every single time I've thought that about someone, they've actually gone further than like way further, way faster than I expect them to. Just because all you need sometimes is just to let your system realize, hey, none of this is the enemy. We're all on this journey together. Even the mind's on this journey. So yeah, that getting underneath the mind helps a lot to combat the analytical stuff. Another really interesting thing though, is that so I have a lot of people who, I'm helping them make all this progress. And then sometimes I tell them if they want to know, I tell them where I think they are from the Jeffrey Martin model, like what location they're in. And a lot of times they'll come the next session and be like, yeah, I'm just doubting that, blah, blah, blah. And they don't really believe what I said. The good news is that doesn't even matter. They can still make progress and still have all the same exact uh like phenomena show up as other people do in these locations that I'm describing. So you can doubt it all you want. You can overanalyze it at a certain point. None of it really matters because the underlying experience just ends up being the same and working.
Which is fascinating that, first of all, that there's often a similar progression.
Yeah.
4 looks about the same, and that often then leads to the 5 experience, or then leads to the 6 experience, etc.
Mm-hmm.
When doing this method on my own recently, I did, as you said, at location 4 and beyond, especially, the mind is not very active. I remember you would ask me during our sessions, "Are there thoughts?" And I'd have to go, "Are there thoughts? Are there thoughts? Is there any,
What is the
and
thought
like,
again?
no, there's really, it's pretty quiet in here,
Right.
um, and so the mind was not creating the normal mind stuff at lower locations. And that was, of course, a relief. But when I did this recently, there was a little bit, especially, going from 2, 3, 4 of the mind going, okay, let's move it, baby. Let's get to 10. Let's, okay, 4, nice to see you. Let's get to 5, baby. And of
Yeah,
course,
yeah.
that's not helpful. It's all about totally sinking into your current experience, not trying to get to the next one. And is that
Well,
a common problem?
it isn't. It isn't. If you can harness that you can actually use that to, if you can just like capture the energy of that and like
Mm.
channel it into your sinking in. I mean, that's kind of what happened to me when I first got,
Ah, interesting.
when I realized I had gone from 4 to 5, which I did, using the technique that I discovered, like stumbled into. Um, I didn't believe I was in 5. I was like, oh, I'm not getting this. Like, there's a description that they've given of things glowing is how I interpreted it. I was
Yeah.
like, oh, nothing's glowing. I don't have night vision, which is another thing. It has to do related with how the visuals of light come in, is how Jeffrey and the team have described it. And that wasn't happening. So I just assumed I wasn't experiencing location 5. I knew it was something, and I knew it was
Mhm.
different than 4. I just didn't know what it was. So I was like, all right. So I just went back to earlier location, shifted myself back. And then later that day, though, after work, I was walking in a park and I was like, let's just see what that experience might be. So I went back to it, and all of a sudden I found myself like after 30 minutes or so, I was like, I'm really staring at these trees a lot longer than I normally do,
Yeah.
and grass. And it was the color of green of the new leaves on the trees and in the grass felt like they were coming directly into my eyes instead of being like light reflecting off them. It felt like the color
Uh-huh.
was coming. I was like, self-illumination. That's what people are talking about. Oh my
Yeah.
God. It was like this revelation. But then the so that was great. And I actually like, because I had trained myself to shift back and forth between locations pretty easily, with a thing that Jeffrey's called fluidity. Um, I could compare the visuals of location 4 to location 5. I would just do
Oh,
that back and forth. I was like, oh my God, this flower definitely looks different. Even though I could tell it was the same flower, the colors just seemed richer when I would be in 5, and it felt dull by comparison to location 4. It was wild. So I knew there was a real legitimate nervous system level shift happening, that my actual visual perceptions were changing on that, like that dramatically.
hmm.
I say dramatic, but it was so subtle that I didn't believe it was happening to me. But once I noticed what to look for, it felt dramatic because it's all I could see, right? It was all I could
Right.
notice. However, then the PTSD part of me kind of kicked off of like, oh, you've only been in fundamental being for less than a month. You can't actually be experiencing this. This takes years or decades to get to. So then the trauma part of me was like, no, you can't be experiencing this. And that actually pushed me further. Like it forced me to like try to find the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. I went from 5 to 10 in less than 48 hours of each other, just because I was like, I have to prove to myself that I'm not crazy, that I'm actually experiencing this thing. Because I was like pre-gaslighting myself that I'm not really experiencing what I was experiencing. It was very unpleasant, but I was able to harness that nervous, crazy energy,
Uh-huh.
which crazy is absolutely the right word for it. Crazy energy into pushing myself further. But not everyone could do that. Usually it gets in the way. But if you're able to harness it, you can actually use it to push further.
Well,
Um,
you bring up a couple interesting points. One is that our beliefs that this is impossible or impossible for us is a major obstacle to this, because it might be that with the right technique, it's actually rather easy for a lot of
Mhm.
people. And I, had the same doubt. And then I go, oh, this is totally different than what we were doing 5 minutes ago, you
Right.
know.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
Yeah, it was pretty wild. And also something you said to me in our last session, recently, I had a very big business kind of stressor blow up that was really rather traumatic to my nervous system, and led to me having kind of obsessive thoughts for a while, which is not how I normally am. It's like,
Yeah.
this is yucky.
Right.
And your advice was, as you get into the further locations, that's a way to decondition trauma. Well, I do, a lot of MDMA therapy and other trauma work, so I'm familiar with a lot of different methods. And I was going through my method protocols of different kinds, and nothing was working very well. And I did find, well, as I entered location 7, 8, 9, whatever, that the idea of trauma even becomes like hard to comprehend.
Right.
It'd be like, are you worried about the weather on Neptune? No,
Right. Because who is traumatized at that point? There's just so little identification with anything.
yeah, there's little identification, and I still don't have enough data to know, is that a great or best way to deal with trauma, to decondition it. But it did seem quite effective to, if you have a perspective that's so depersonalized, and then you go back to your day-to-day life, it does seem to uh, make the soil where trauma can be just kind of not there anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely, as you progress further, I mean, you're dropping off parts of the self, for lack of a better term. The
Uh-huh.
further you go, there's like bits and pieces that are just no longer part of what you identify with. So that means that certain feedback loops are just open loops now. They can't keep spiraling. So if
Hmm.
you're in a place where something literally can't spiral into itself and amplify it, then all it can do is release the energy. It just the energy has nowhere else to go except outside, which is kind of an incredible experience. I definitely worked through a lot of trauma that way. I actually was still doing, I did EMDR therapy before and after transitioning. Like I had taken a break for a while and then went back to it after getting into fundamental being. And the level of trauma I was able to release after the fact, and especially as I went further, it was just incredible the pace I was able to go on releasing trauma. And they fed back into each other. Releasing your trauma helps you go further in fundamental being and like
Mm.
helps you stabilize and have a greater sense of peace in general. So, and then that feeds back into your ability to work on trauma more easily because you're coming from a more stable place. So those two yeah, there's a lot of mutually beneficial stuff you can do with trauma and fundamental being. And I want to say, I feel like I've heard Jeffrey describe fundamental being almost as an anti-trauma, because trauma, we already know that there's an experience you can have that fundamentally reorganizes your nervous system in an instant. It's usually leads to increased reactivity, and this is called trauma. So you can have an experience, bam, all of a sudden everything about how you perceive the world is changed, especially
Mm-hmm.
related to certain situations. Well, that's kind of how fundamental being is. It's just in the opposite direction of like all of a sudden, like that, you have less reactivity, you have more stability internally. And, you know, pushing further in that experience gives you even more access to that sort of internal stability. Yeah.
By the way, just as a side note, I don't remember whether we mentioned that EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, just for people who might want to look into it on their own.
Yeah, I would have said that, but I can never remember what the D and the R are. So
Me
thank
neither.
you.
I had to Google it just now.
I
I
have
appreciate
trauma
that.
about that. I can never remember. And my wife is an EMDR therapist, so it's a,
Nice.
But one thing I'm curious about, and maybe this might be jumping ahead in your experience, but several of the locations, the further locations as described, um, might be a little scary. They might involve maybe not being able to function well in the real world. And yet, when you got past them, you seem to have gotten to a point where the real world came back, where you were able to refunction. And I was wondering if you could, fill that out
Yeah,
a little.
I'll actually also say real quick that the lack of functionality of later locations is mostly overblown from my experience. Me and my research partner Luciano have talked to, outside of formal interviews, we talked to several dozen people who've made it to the far end of the progression, and I don't know that we saw a single case of someone becoming non-functional because of going further. That just never seemed to be the case. Lots of people, you know, pulled themselves slightly away from society more and more, but they were in a position to do that in their lives and things like that. But it wasn't a because they could no longer hold down a job. I don't think we saw a single case of that. And in working with people, I'm getting them through, what we've called non-existence. I tend to use the label Region 3 in my map of things in my model. But when people hear it, it's like, oh, you don't feel like you exist anymore. You feel like nothing around you exists. That's a really extreme sounding thing, but it's pretty fine whenever you're in it. It doesn't feel as extreme as it sounds. So I'm also working on the language around that to not freak people out
yeah,
about that
yeah.
experience.
Oh, I'd
Uh,
love to have non-existence. That doesn't
ex-
sound like how much does that
exactly,
cost?
or exactly. But it's really like I've worked with several people at this point who've made it through that, have jobs, they work with people, they lead teams at major corporations. I was working at a major corporation with tons of like inner office politics that I had to deal with constantly, and I was able to do all of that from all these later stages. So I'll just say that. However, as you mentioned, it does come to a point when you push far enough that the human side of things comes back. I want to say with a vengeance, because it's so much there again. It feels more functional and more with a greater ability to engage with the world than even the location 1 through 3 did, where you still have all this normal human mind stuff going on. You're not very distant or derealized from a lot of these parts of your identity. Um, but there's still a level of like distance from normal human life and desires that happens, that you don't even realize happens until they start coming back and you're like, oh wow, I can just engage with stories and fiction again in a way that I wasn't able to for quite a long time on this progression. Or, oh, when other people talk about all the bullshit that's happening in their lives, it doesn't bother me anymore. Huh, that's interesting. I can just sit with that and hold it. It doesn't take away from my peace to have stress happening around me. And so once that happens, it's just so, I don't know, it's really incredible. I love it. It was like one of the best things that ever happened to me in my life, having all of the human things come back. Because for me, this is kind of shocking when people who are having the experience of fundamental being find out that I did this. I was I was so intent on being able to still relate to people who were not having an experience of lasting inner peace, because that's fairly unrelatable to the overwhelming majority of humans. Like, oh, you're just content all the time on some level. Like, what? What does that mean? That's not the human condition. But I was so dead set on being able to still relate to people directly and their narratives and all their bullshit that they had. I wanted to do that. So I was actually training myself to pop out of fundamental being and back into it. I wanted to become to where I could stably do that back and forth. I don't recommend anyone try doing that. It was very physically painful to come back into fundamental being, like after I popped out. And the level of noise in the mind that I had lived with all my life and just had forgotten about already, it was so incredibly painful. But that was me. I was so dead set on trying to still relate to people that I was willing to put myself through this sort of painful experience to try to do that. I gave up after I realized how physically painful it was. It literally felt like needles all through my body when I came back into location 1 from location 0 or non-fundamental well-being. However, at a certain point, things just started coming back, and then I started talking to Luciano, my research partner, because he was having a similar progression as me. I was like, "Hey, this feels normal again, right? Like it doesn't feel like it's not normal. It doesn't feel transcendent in any way. It just feels like we're humans again, right? Like this feels crazy. Did we drop out? Like what happened?" It's like, no, we still have peace all the time. And actually we have more peace than ever before. But because it's always in the foreground, there's no reason for anything to take away from that. So yeah, narratives come back and it's very pleasant. I don't know.
Well,
Yeah.
that
That's
sounds
great.
very hopeful, and it sounds
Yeah.
marvelous. And I also find it fascinating. I think that even though you are not recommending people do this, I think we can learn from hearing you talk about the contrast when you talk about the noise, because that's what's happening when we're not in fundamental well-being. Fundamental well-being is, in my view, already here, but is being blocked out by the noise. And the
Right.
noise is the obsessive thoughts about how we're doing, past, future, ego, etc. And when those clear up, it seems that the fundamental well-being that's already there just seems to, like clouds part, and you see
Yeah.
it.
That's definitely how it feels. Yeah, the clouds parting, the clarity that comes with it. It's pretty nice. Yep.
So I'm interested, I've been guided by you in 3 sessions and found it fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about how that becomes integrated into a person's life? What was the progression for you, or what you're seeing in the people you work with?
Yeah. So one of the things that I do that I think is really probably provides the most value of having sessions with someone like me, because I'm also training other coaches and working with other coaches to do this for other people as well, is that a lot of people can get glimpses of these later, progressively later things, but they can't get themselves to stabilize there to where they can start integrating it with their life. But because you're working in a session with someone, one who knows what they're looking for, like has an idea of about where someone might be, so they know what questions to ask, that automatically gets you start being aware of different aspects of the experience that you may not have noticed on your own. So just being more aware of more parts of it, bam, you're already a little bit more stable. Then also, I'm asking you questions about your direct experience. One, because I'm curious to know what you're experiencing, but also because it helps get your mind to go, hey, this is a real thing that's happening because I have to articulate it. So now it becomes a little bit more real. It's more of your system engaging with it. And not only that, you have to engage with the social system to some extent. So that already is bringing a level of functionality into it that may not be there otherwise. Because I have plenty of people when they're shifting deeper, I'm not sure what causes this sometimes, but some people really just, there's like an intense gravity and they feel like they can't even talk in after certain shifts. So I go,
Yeah.
okay, that's fine. Can you talk from that place of gravity? And almost inevitably, it becomes lighter and lighter the more they answer my questions. So they're speaking from this place of stillness and this place of peace. And it just, as they keep doing it, they get better at it. And the words come a lot easier, even if they're not thinking about it. The words are just happening. But so that makes it so that they can just, after the session, not everyone stays 100% stable like between sessions, but a lot of people do. And I think a lot of it is because we're already practicing that functionality and integrating with social interactions, like doing it from this place of peace, from this place of stillness. So yeah, that's a huge thing of really trying to do everything from this new place that you're stabilizing in. Yeah.
When as you're working with people, do they generally want to start at one and go up the quote ladder, or might somebody start at 5 or 6 or 7 and proceed from there?
Yeah, I have plenty of people who don't. I mean, I have people like you who have fluidity, so they go back and forth, or something like that. Or maybe even some people aren't training fluidity to shift consciously between locations. But let's say they just have a location they're really comfortable with right now. A lot of times they'll just drift back naturally. They'll go to sleep and wake up in that location because they're mostly integrated there, and that's how they normally operate. That typically that actually increases over time as we get them. There's a leading and trailing edge kind of effect that happens where we just keep pushing further, and then the location they're comfortable with actually bumps up over time. But plenty of people actually just stay at the same location that they shifted into. And I'm talking people who had been in locations 1 through 4 for years, decades. Now all of a sudden they're shifting into 4, 5, 6, 12, 18, whatever numbers you want to put on it. And in between sessions, they come back the next session, they're right where they left off. They didn't, and they were just living their life, going to their jobs, interacting with their families, and they come back, and we just take up where we left off from there. So yeah, there's all sorts of different options for that. It just kind of depends on what the person's comfortable with and what how their system wants to navigate things. Yeah.
How does this sound to you, Brian?
It all sounds absolutely fascinating. And also, I don't think in terms of location. So it's interesting to me to hear about it. I mean, I've read Jeffrey's book and experience. I mean, so I know the theory behind it, but in my direct experience, they don't feel like locations I enter. It feels like something that's just available all the time, should I want it at any moment.
Okay.
And that's just how it looks from here. And
That's
yet
some pretty advanced stuff if that's true. So I would love to pick your brain at some point. Or not pick your brain, but pick your nervous system is really what I would love to do.
Well,
Like hidden fingers in there.
that would be great because I feel the same way about you. But because there's and yet
there's a budding love affair here. I'm witnessing
the curiosity.
Yeah.
Starts to overcome. Like, have I really experienced that? I'm not sure. It would be interesting, Yeah.
Yeah. One of the cool things about this too is that, I mean, I have so many people who don't have a direct experience with locations, but we just work with one shift at a time because that's what I did, right? Like I felt with the technique I stumbled into, I honestly called it a consciousness parlor trick for a while because I assumed no one else was experiencing what I was experiencing and it wouldn't apply to anyone else. And okay, I'm shifting into a new thing. Oh yeah, suddenly the present moment just feels kind of non-linear and past and future don't really matter anymore. So what? Like it just felt like a so what kind of thing. And yeah, so like it literally, I called it locations, but I didn't really know if it was locations in the Jeffery sense of the term. But even with people who aren't experiencing these distinct shifts on their day-to-day life and as part of their progression, working with this process, they don't have to think about it. It just kind of still works, which is kind of cool. I have a couple of people who I've worked with so far who have no background in any of Jeffrey Martin's work. And they had no concept of locations at all, or even fundamental being as a thing until I talked with them, even though they were already in it and experiencing it, which I could tell from a couple of, some short conversations we had. But they still got all the benefits of pushing further and going deeper, even though they didn't have to think about it in terms of locations, regions, any of that stuff. So yeah. And obviously people have been making progress in this for thousands of years without any concept of locations and any experience of locations. So yeah, this is far from a new thing that we're doing, but
Yeah,
it's a new technique maybe.
And as a matter of fact, that reminds me of something that when I was on your website going through your model and hearing you talk about it on the Max Hug interview, I was reminded of Gareth Dignam, who was a guest on our podcast previously, and his terminology is all from India. It's all about
Mm-hmm.
Shaktipada and Nirvikalpa Samadhi and all of that stuff. And yet, when he talks about his progression and where it ends, it actually tracks in a very similar way, but the
That's awesome.
language is completely different.
Right. Yeah, there's a similar thing that's happening with fetters. I don't know that the 10 fetters from Buddhism can track 100% with the locations. And also they're used very differently. The locations are just kind of mile markers of a progression that's already, they're just descriptive. Whereas the fetters are like, okay, here's what you focus on dropping next. Okay, here's the part of the self you need to drop next. So it's more prescriptive. However, the last two fetters do seem to correlate with the tail end of the process that we've, like Luciano and I have just uncovered recently. So there is something there. It's definitely not nothing, but yeah, it's interesting to see how different maps line up with each other. One thing we were resonating with for a while was the Zen circle, which it's a circle because you come back to the fully human side of things where everything just feels
Mhm.
like a normal human. Turns out there's a little bit beyond that. So I don't know that the Zen circle is a full complete map. The same with the 10 ox herder paintings, if anyone's familiar with that. The final
Yeah.
painting is the return to the marketplace, which I always thought was fascinating because it's like it's an economic activity that they're painting. It's like you come to all the bullshit that comes with economic activity in the marketplace, right? Like you're hawking your wares and things like that and like haggling with people. But that's exactly what you're capable of once you make it far enough. It's like it just becomes fine to do the normal human activities again. Um, and again, I still don't think that's a complete progression. It does seem like there's a little bit further than the return to human. But yeah, it's always fascinating to see the different progressions, how people map them out.
And it's fascinating that there's from many different angles, they're kind of converging on a few ideas and also very few methods,
Hmm.
that in the perfectly okay community, uh, so many people have now moved towards, okay, it's all about sinking in. And I would warn people that, anything that simple, there's probably nuance and there's probably it doesn't fit everybody all the time, and different people need different things at different times.
Hmm.
But the level of simplicity and connection that has moved in that direction, I find fascinating.
Yeah, one of the cool things about sinking in, which again, I did not come up with, that was something I 100% ripped from Jeffrey Martin. I just talk about it a lot.
Hmm.
And I think the difference is that I've given very explicit instructions on how to sink in, which I don't know that he ever gave. He did do some teachings on it, but it wasn't as step by step as I tend to do it.
Yeah.
But it is a more like you're going from outside to in. So you just find whatever is there for you and whatever works with you is really the important part of sinking in. And it's not even when I say it's a practice to people, I mean in the sense of you want to practice this skill of tapping into that that sense of peace or stillness or whatever it is that you can connect with. That's all it is. You want to just get better at it, literally as a skill building, not as a, oh, I'm going to sink in for an hour. Like that's not the practice. It is, how do I get better at tapping into that? What do I need to do to access that? And whatever that is for you, that's sinking in my book. So
Yeah.
yeah, the fact that it's really everyone can kind of come up with their own techniques at that point, as long as they understand what the intent of it is. I mean, we have people, one guy, he would drink tea for 3 hours every morning. That was his sinking in practice. And that's how I mean, he blasted through the entire progression. It was really wild to hear his story. It was so incredible. But his main practice was just like a tea ceremony every single morning for 3 hours. And you got the warm tea and all that. I understand that. It feels like a warm hug on the inside. So of course, it's going to make it easier to sink in. I did baths for a while, like literally soaking in the tub, like the metaphor that Jeffrey gives. I just took it literally and did it, and it actually worked. So that was kind of incredible.
So
Luciano
part
talked about
of part
walking
of
in the
sinking in can
yeah.
be sinking into your daily life experience.
Yeah, well, and that's part of it is that you the reason you want to practice that technique is to bring it into your daily experience.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
want your daily experience more and more to come from this place
Uh-huh.
because then, I mean, the sky's the limit from there. It just gets really, really awesome from there. So, yeah.
I think you're going to be leading a sinking in type of meditation. Is there anything you want to say or that we haven't touched upon before we do that?
Um, no, not really. I think we touched on everything I wanted to talk about today. I'm just really excited that to talk about this work. It's been really incredible to see. I had zero hopes that it would be beneficial to anyone else, any of these techniques that I discovered on my own. I thought no one else would be able to relate to it. So the fact that it's been so resonant with so many people gives me a lot of hope that I mean, we can probably do a lot of work in this area to make fundamental being just a mainstream thing. That's really what I want. I don't
Yeah.
want it to be something that you have to be a mystic or a spiritual person or go be in a monastery to experience this. I really think people should think of it in the same way that they do nutrition or exercise. Like we used to take food advice from religion. You know, we're not that far off in the grand scheme of things from having done that. That's being where we take our food advice from. But now we have nutrition and it's a new perspective. I mean, I live in South Louisiana, it's where I was born and raised, and we just finished Lent, where people still eat only seafood on Fridays. That is like the thing that everyone still does here. But you can also have nutrition if you have a specific goal you're trying to go for with eating your food. I think we have the same opportunity here for fundamental well-being. I think Jeffrey's work laid a lot of the foundation that sure, you can still be a Buddhist or a Christian or all these different things. You can still do psychedelics, but you don't have to do any of that stuff. We can decouple it and say, hey, what is this underlying thing of inner peace? And if you just want to make that max that out, here's another perspective that'll really be efficient towards that. And I don't know, I think that's a really incredible, we have a really incredible opportunity here to make that happen. So I'm really excited to be in this space right now.
Yeah, and it's totally separate from any really belief system or dogma, which makes it more accessible to more people.
Yeah, exactly. I'm a ruthless pragmatist, so I didn't go into this with any. I have no inherent. This process is not inherently valuable in me. It's just valuable because of how awesome it makes my life. So,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
that's
Here,
great.
here.
Well, before you do the meditation, I want to thank our Patreon supporters that make this possible. And we send a bunch of extra stuff to them. So if you're interested in how to support the podcast or get free stuff or extra stuff from us, go to patreon.com/awareness explorers. And with that announcement, I think you're going to be guiding us in a meditation.
Sounds good. All right, let's get into it. All right, so if you're not already, feel free to get into a comfortable position, but not so comfortable that you're going to fall asleep. We want gentle awareness. If it's more comfortable for you to keep your eyes open, feel free to do so. For most people, they like to close their eyes. Either way is fine, but feel free to do so now. And gently take a deep breath in and exhale slowly. And with every breath, allow yourself to relax more and more into your current experience and into your present moment. If you notice any distractions, any effort, any resistances, just make a gentle note of them and come back to the underlying experience. And as you continue to breathe, allow yourself to connect with maybe a sense of stillness or peace or openness. Maybe it's in your body, maybe it's deeper than that. Whatever it is and however it shows up, just allow yourself to connect with that and notice it. Allow your awareness to gently rest on that experience. And with every breath, allow yourself to relax deeper and ease more completely into that experience. No need for any effort. We're just watching that relaxation happen, just observing it unfold. And as you continue to breathe, allow yourself to connect with a sense of gratitude for this experience. If you can, allow the feeling of gratitude to fill you up. Otherwise, just orient your system towards expressing gratitude and let that come from more and more of your being with every breath. And allow yourself to express gratitude for even having glimpses of this experience. How even glimpses of it is pretty incredible compared to most people's experiences. And allow yourself to gently come back to the underlying experience, just letting it wash all over you directly. Allow yourself to submerge more deeply into it, dissolving into that experience. And allow yourself to start to notice different qualities of that experience. Does it feel warm or cool or neither or both? Notice if there are any emotional qualities to the experience or maybe a subtle pleasantness, or if it just feels neutral. Maybe there's an emptiness to it or a fullness to it, or neither. Notice how thoughts are showing up, or if the mind feels quiet or more active. And notice how the body shows up. Do you feel connected to the body at all? Does it feel like just sensations arising? Does the body feel like it has a different shape or no shape at all? And allow yourself to gently come back to that underlying experience. Just breathing it in. No need for any labels or any categories. Just allowing it to show up. And as you continue to breathe and become more settled in this experience, you can gently wiggle your fingers and toes, allowing the movement to come from the place of this experience. And if it feels right and you feel ready, you can gradually and gently open your eyes and invite this experience into everything you see, everything you hear. Invite it into all of your senses. That's about it.
I like how at the end you invite uh, that feeling or experience into eyes open and even moving our body. I found, often when I get out of meditation, it's like, okay, next thing, and that integration period, I think, is really important for bringing it into more of our daily experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I thought that was really lovely. And I agree with Jonathan. I think that's a great transition period. I remember Adyashanti used to say at the end of some of his meditations, and don't imagine that meditation is now over.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
That's great. I never heard that.
It's been lovely, Rastal, and I appreciate your influence in my life and other people's lives and look forward to ongoing connection. People
Likewise.
can best get hold of you through your website, I guess, which is ConsciousCuriosity.cc.
That's correct. It's a really cool name, but it can be tough to type even for me. So if, no worries if it takes you a couple of tries to type that out.
We'll put a link in the show notes.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Uh,
Uh,
Hopefully this kind of new approach, call it new, newly packaged or newly focused, was going to affect a lot of people. I like how it doesn't have any dogma, the simplicity of it. It can work with people who are new to meditation and people who've been doing it for 40 years. And may your work reach a lot of people.
yeah, that's the hope. So thank y'all so much for having me on. This has been really fun. I enjoyed this conversation immensely. So yeah.
Me too. What a delight to have you.
And to our listeners, keep exploring.
Keep exploring.
Keep exploring.
All right.
Woo-hoo! Thank you for listening to Awareness Explorers. To learn more, you can check out our website at awarenessexplorers.com. Please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast app. We'd love it if you would post a review. And please share our link on Facebook and with family and friends, because knowing yourself as awareness is the greatest gift you can give yourself or someone you love.